power can be an illusion until someone takes it from you. Richard Lancaster was a man who had everything: wealth, influence, and the belief that no one could ever challenge him. He ruled from the top, believing the rules didn't apply to him. But today, at 35,000 feet, his world is about to come crashing down. When Marcus Grant, a man Richard dismissed as insignificant, takes a seat in first class, it should have been just another flight. But a moment of arrogance sets off a chain reaction that no one saw coming. Because Marcus isn't just another passenger. What begins as an act of humiliation turns into a brutal game of power, a battle where reputations, careers, and entire legacies will be rewritten before the plane even lands. Who really holds control? Who gets to decide who belongs where? And when the tables turn, will Richard fight to hold on to his empire? Or realize too late that it was never really his to begin with? Tell me, if you were Marcus, how far would you go for justice? Comment your thoughts below. If you love stories of betrayal, power plays, and ruthless revenge, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because, trust me, this is only the beginning. Marcus Grant stepped onto the plane, the polished leather soles of his shoes making no sound against the sleek flooring of a first-class cabin. He moved with quiet confidence, his charcoal gray suit impeccably tailored to his lean, athletic frame. He had taken thousands of flights in his lifetime, yet every time he entered a space like this, there was always a moment of hesitation from others, a brief flicker in their gaze as they recalibrated their assumptions about who belonged here. He ignored it. Reaching the overhead compartment, Marcus placed his carry-on bag inside with effortless precision before lowering himself into seat 2B. As he adjusted his cuffs, his sharp eyes caught the subtle movement of a man turning toward him from seat 2A. Richard Lancaster, the CEO of Lancaster Enterprises, sat comfortably, one leg crossed over the other, a glass of whiskey balanced between his fingers. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back with precision, his custom navy suit bearing the unmistakable sheen of power and excess. But it wasn't his appearance that made Marcus take notice. It was the smirk, the kind of smirk that belonged to men who thought the world revolved around them. Richard exhaled slowly, setting his glass down on the tray table with a deliberate clink. His gaze flicked over Marcus's attire, his posture, assessing, measuring, dismissing. Then came the words. "Let me guess," Richard drawled, his voice dripping with amusement. "You're lost." Marcus turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. There was no surprise, no irritation, just patience. "No," he said evenly. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Richard let out a low chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "That's so." He reached for his drink again, swirling the amber liquid as if contemplating something profound. Then he smirked. "Last time I saw someone like you in first class," Richard mused, tilting his head, "he was pouring my drink." The words hung in the air like the sharp sting of whiskey on an open wound. A few passengers chuckled under their breath. Not loudly, just enough. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't scowl, didn't tense, didn't give them what they wanted. Instead, he leaned back, adjusting the cuffs of his suit with deliberate ease. His fingers traced a platinum watch on his wrist, a subtle reminder of who he was and what he had built. Richard was waiting for something. A reaction, a retort, an acknowledgement that his words had landed. Instead, Marcus simply smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "That must be hard," Marcus said finally, his voice smooth as silk. Richard frowned, clearly thrown off. "What?" "Watching the world change," Marcus said, turning his head just enough to look him in the eyes. "Realizing your time at the top is running out." A flicker, brief but unmistakable. The corner of Richard's smirk twitched, like a man who had been grazed by a bullet and wasn't sure yet if he should be afraid. His fingers curled around the glass just a fraction tighter. Then he scoffed. "Cute," Richard muttered. "Real cute." But something in his posture had shifted. For the first time in a very long time, Richard Lancaster felt something he wasn't used to feeling. Uncertainty. The tension in the first-class cabin was subtle, but it was there. A lingering weight in the air after Marcus Grant had refused to bite the bait Richard Lancaster had dangled before him. Marcus remained composed, his expression unreadable, as he turned his gaze toward the window. He had dealt with men like Richard before, men who mistook privilege for superiority, who believed legacy meant ownership, who assumed his presence was a mistake that needed correction. It was almost predictable. What wasn't predictable was what happened next. A sharp beep cut through the quiet luxury of first class. A flight attendant at the front of the cabin stiffened as her tablet screen flashed red. Her face went pale. Then, suddenly, she turned toward Marcus. Marcus caught the movement in his peripheral vision, but didn't react. Not yet. The flight attendant, a woman in her early 40s with a tightly wound bun and sharp features, hesitated for only a second before stepping forward briskly. Her heels clicked against the carpet as she approached his row. "Sir," she said, voice tight, forced professional. "I need to ask you a question." Marcus looked up calm. "Go ahead." Her fingers curled slightly around the edge of her tablet. "Do you have any sharp objects in your possession?" For the first time, a ripple of unease spread through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads. A businessman across the aisle lowered his newspaper slightly. A woman clutching a designer handbag shifted uncomfortably. Marcus frowned, tilting his head slightly. "No," he said evenly. "Why?" The flight attendant hesitated. Then a loud, jarring alarm blared through the cabin. People flinched. A woman in the back of first class gasped audibly. The overhead screens lit up, and to Marcus's growing intrigue, a security feed appeared on the monitors. A grainy video. A man, walking through the airport terminal, dressed in the same charcoal gray suit he wore now. Marcus watched, expression still unreadable, as the footage zoomed in, catching the exact moment he reached into his inside jacket pocket. From this angle, his hand obscured the object he withdrew. Then, just as quickly, the screen cut to static. A few passengers murmured under their breath. The flight attendant swallowed. "Sir, we need to conduct a search." Marcus's fingers drummed once against the armrest. He let out a slow breath. Then he turned his gaze to Richard. The CEO was watching him intently, the corner of his mouth twitching, as if resisting a full-blown smirk. His eyes glimmered with something triumphant. Marcus understood instantly. This wasn't coincidence. This was a trap, and it had been carefully planned. The silence in first class had taken on a new weight, heavier than before. It was no longer the comfortable hush of exclusivity, but something sharper, something charged. Marcus Grant sat still, shoulders relaxed against the supple leather of seat 2B. His breathing remained steady, his expression unreadable. Around him, however, the world had already started reacting. Whispers traveled like ripples through the cabin. A businessman peeked over the top of his newspaper. A woman clutched the strap of her designer handbag a little tighter. None of it surprised Marcus. He had seen this kind of situation before. The way power moved in rooms like these. The way influence shaped reality. He knew exactly what was happening. A soft chuckle broke the silence. Richard Lancaster leaned back in his seat, swirling the amber liquid in his glass with an air of complete satisfaction. His expression carried the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. With one hand, he lifted his phone, angling the screen so only Marcus could see. That was a message. Everything is in place. Don't let him board. And right beneath it, a fresh deposit of $500,000. The transaction had been made just minutes ago. Marcus didn't blink. His gaze lingered on the screen for half a second before shifting back to Richard, taking in the smug tilt of his mouth, the lazy confidence in the way he held his drink. Richard mistook the silence for hesitation. His smirk widened. "Funny, isn't it?" His voice was low, just for the two of them. How security protocols always seem to work the way they should. Some people just don't understand their limits. Marcus exhaled slowly. So that was the game. Men like Richard had always played this way, predators in tailored suits who had never been told no in any way that mattered. They saw the world as something to be manipulated, their influence as something absolute. Richard expected fear. Instead, Marcus smiled. The reaction was subtle, but it was enough. Richard's smirk flickered, so slight that most wouldn't have noticed. But Marcus did. The moment passed quickly, and Richard covered it with another sip of whiskey. But the damage was done. The cabin snapped into motion. Two uniformed men appeared at the front of first class, airport security officers, their expressions unreadable, their presence an unspoken warning. One of them, a tall man with a military-style buzz. "Cut, step forward first. Sir, we need you to come with us for questioning." A ripple of unease spread through the cabin. The socialite in the front row kept her eyes fixed on her phone, pretending not to watch. The businessman across the aisle adjusted his tie. The woman with the designer handbag glanced toward the flight attendants, as if waiting for reassurance that everything was fine. Richard exhaled loudly, shaking his head like a man witnessing an unfortunate but expected outcome. "Damn shame," he murmured. "Really thought you were smarter than this." Marcus still didn't move. The security officers waited, their presence pressing down like a physical weight. The longer Marcus remained still, the heavier the silence became. Then slowly, Marcus sat forward. Not in surrender, not in hesitation, but with precision, his movements deliberate, controlled. His fingers brushed over the smooth fabric of his sleeve as he adjusted his cuff with an ease that made Richard's fingers tighten around his glass. Finally, Marcus looked at him. "You really went through all this trouble," he said, voice calm. "And this is the best you could do?" Richard's smirk twitched, barely noticeable, but Marcus caught it. The taller security officer shifted slightly, as if expecting Marcus to resist. Instead, Marcus leaned back again, resting one arm comfortably on the armrest, completely ignoring the men standing over him. "If you're going to cuff me," he said lazily, "do it. But make sure you're ready for what happens next." The air changed. Not for Marcus, but for them. Richard had spent the entire flight thinking he was in control, that he was orchestrating something inevitable. But Marcus saw it now, the hesitation in the officers, the uncertainty in the flight attendant watching from the galley, the way Richard's hand curled ever so slightly around the base of his whiskey glass. He wasn't as sure as he pretended to be. The problem with men like Richard was that they were used to winning. They were used to power bending to their will. They never expected it to slip through their fingers. But Marcus could see it happening already. Richard Lancaster had just realized something. He wasn't in control anymore. Marcus Grant remained perfectly still, his posture unshaken as the two airport security officers loomed over him. The taller of the two, the one with the military buzz cut, pulled out a pair of handcuffs, his grip firm and practiced. He wasn't hesitating. "Sir," the officer said, his voice steady, "hold out your hands." A ripple of reaction moved through first class. Some passengers pretended not to watch, feigning indifference while subtly angling their heads. Others made no effort to hide their curiosity. The woman in 3A whispered something to her husband. A man in the front row leaned forward, clearly entertained. Richard Lancaster took a slow sip of his whiskey, his smirk widening as he set the glass down with deliberate care. "You know," he mused, voice casual, "there are two types of men in the world. Those who understand the rules, and those who think they can break them." He exhaled, shaking his head in mock disappointment. "And then there's you, thinking the rules don't apply." Marcus finally moved. He extended his wrists, palms up, his expression unreadable. His watch gleamed under the cabin lights, the motion so smooth, so unbothered, that even the officers hesitated for half a second. Then the lights flickered. For a brief moment, the cabin dimmed. A few passengers gasped, startled by the sudden shift. The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances. The lights surged back to full brightness just as quickly, but something had changed. Richard's phone was gone. The smirk that had been plastered on his face froze, the victory in his eyes faltering. He patted his suit pocket, then checked the tray table, his movements sharp, less controlled now. The whiskey glass rattled slightly against the wood. Marcus didn't look at him. He didn't need to, because the overhead monitors had changed. The security footage that had been playing was gone. In its place, a new message appeared in bold white letters against a jet black screen. Transaction records uploaded. Data sent to Lancaster Corp Board of Directors. Lisa, the blonde flight attendant, took a step back, her eyes flicking between Marcus and Richard, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The officers stiffened, their confusion evident. Marcus slowly leaned back in his seat, adjusting his cufflinks with the same deliberate ease he had shown all along. The tension was no longer on him. It had shifted. Richard's fingers curled into fists. "What the hell is this?" he growled, his voice lower now, harsher. Marcus tilted his head slightly, finally giving him his full attention. "Something wrong?" Richard's breathing had quickened, just enough for Marcus to notice. His eyes darted to the flight attendants, to the passengers who were now very much watching him, not Marcus. He was losing control. "Where's my phone?" Richard demanded, his voice rising just enough to draw more attention. Marcus didn't answer, because at that moment, the speakers crackled to life. A robotic chime played, followed by a pre-recorded flight announcement. But instead of the usual update about cruising altitude, a different voice spoke. A woman's voice, to the board members of Lancaster Corp. "You have received a file containing financial activity flagged for immediate review. This data has been independently verified and traced to an unauthorized transaction made today." Richard's face turned a shade paler. Passengers whispered among themselves. The flight attendants didn't move. The woman's voice continued. "Please be advised that failure to report suspicious financial activity is a direct violation of corporate governance laws." Marcus observed the shift in Richard's demeanor. The once arrogant CEO's fingers trembled slightly, where they rested against his armrest. He looked like a man trying to process a disaster in real time, trying to reverse engineer a problem he didn't see coming. Then, his eyes snapped back to Marcus. "You did this," Richard hissed. Marcus raised a brow. "You sure about that?" Richard opened his mouth, then closed it, because he wasn't sure anymore. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted. First class was no longer his stage, his domain. The invisible hand that had always placed him at the top had been removed, and now he was dangling, exposed, vulnerable. And Marcus? Marcus was just getting started. The silence inside first class had turned from anticipation to something colder. It wasn't just tension anymore, it was uncertainty. The kind that came when people who were used to control suddenly realized they had none. Richard Lancaster was realizing that now. The words on the screen hadn't changed. The flight attendants hadn't moved. The security officers hadn't spoken. It was as if time had frozen, the moment stretching out just long enough for Richard to understand something crucial. He was losing. His breathing was slower now, more controlled. But Marcus could see it, the slight tremor in his fingers as they flexed against the armrest, the way his gaze darted between the monitors and the flight crew, searching for a lifeline. Marcus didn't move. He just watched. Richard exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as if wiping away invisible sweat. Then, slowly, he leaned toward Lisa, the blonde flight attendant who had hesitated earlier. His voice was lower now, measured. "I need a phone," he murmured. "Now." Lisa didn't react right away. For the first time since boarding, she wasn't looking at him the same way. Gone was the eager attentiveness, the subtle deference that first-class passengers were used to receiving. Now, she looked at him with something that almost resembled pity. Richard's fingers curled tighter around his armrest. "What the hell are you waiting for?" he whispered, voice sharp enough that a few passengers turned their heads. "Get me a phone." Lisa hesitated, then took a step closer. She bent down, speaking just low enough that only Richard could hear. "Mr. Lancaster," she swallowed. "The first-class ticket you're flying on, it was purchased by the chairman of your own company." Richard went completely still. For a second, he didn't even blink. His brain scrambled to process what she had just said, to fit it into some logical explanation that didn't mean what it obviously meant. Lisa stepped back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked uncomfortable, like she had just delivered a message she wished she hadn't. Richard's pulse pounded in his ears. "No," he said under his breath. His lips barely moved. "That's not possible." But deep down he knew it was. This wasn't just an attack on his reputation. This wasn't some boardroom power play that he could spin his way out of. This was a full-scale execution of his career, orchestrated with surgical precision. And the worst part? It had already happened. Marcus shifted in his seat, tilting his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Something wrong, Richard?" Richard snapped his head toward him, fury flashing behind his eyes. "You think this is over?" His voice was lower now, full of restrained rage. "You have no idea what you've just done." Marcus simply smiled. "No, Richard," he said smoothly. "I know exactly what I've done." Richard's nails dug into the armrest. His mind raced for solutions, a way out, anything he could do to regain control. But the second Lisa had spoken those words, he knew there was no way out. Marcus leaned back, exhaling slowly, as if settling in for the show. Richard wasn't sure whether he wanted to lash out or throw up. The tension in the first-class cabin was no longer just about Marcus Grant. Richard Lancaster was now the center of attention, though not in the way he was accustomed to. The weight of Lisa's words still hung over him like an executioner's blade. "Your first-class ticket was purchased by the chairman of your own company." Richard's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Who orchestrated this? Who had the power to move against him so decisively? Then his phone rang. Or rather, the loaner phone Lisa had reluctantly handed over. His own device had mysteriously vanished, but whoever was behind this wanted to make sure he got this call. The number on the screen was one he recognized immediately. It was his wife. He hesitated for just a second before answering. "Claire," he started, keeping his voice low. A sharp breath on the other end. Then pure venom. "What the hell did you just do?" Richard tensed, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. But of course they were. Every passenger in first class had already sensed something was wrong. They weren't just watching Marcus anymore. They were watching him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said through clenched teeth. Claire let out a hollow laugh. "You don't know? Are you serious, Richard?" She inhaled sharply, trying to compose herself. But the fury seeped through every word. "I just got off a call with legal. Your name is all over an unauthorized wire transfer. $500,000 flagged for suspicious activity. And guess what? The board got it too." A chill ran down Richard's spine. This wasn't just a smear campaign. This was an execution. "This is a setup," he hissed. "Someone's trying to take me down." "Oh, you think?" Claire shot back. "Who do you think is behind this, Richard? Who did you piss off so badly that they went through all this trouble? Or are you going to sit there and pretend like you don't have enemies?" Richard opened his mouth, but before he could answer, the cabin door unlocked. The sound was subtle, but the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The door to the cockpit swung open, and the captain stepped out. He was an older man, late 50s, his uniform crisp, his posture authoritative. But it was his eyes that Richard noticed first, sharp, assessing, and locked onto him, with a quiet intensity that sent a wave of unease through his body. The captain stopped just a few feet away. "Mr. Lancaster," he said evenly, his voice carrying through the silent cabin. Richard stared back, gripping the phone tighter. "What?" The captain's gaze didn't waver. "I just received direct orders," he said, his voice calm, deliberate. "From the new principal owner of Lancaster Corporation." Richard's stomach dropped. His grip loosened around the phone. Claire was still on the line, demanding answers, but her voice had faded into the background noise. His vision narrowed, the world tilting slightly. This wasn't just a public humiliation. This wasn't just a career-ending scandal. This was a takeover, and he never even saw it coming. The world around Richard Lancaster had stopped making sense. Minutes ago, he was untouchable. He was the one people looked up to, not out of admiration, but out of fear, out of the sheer power he wielded. But now, the walls were closing in, and he could feel it. His wife's voice was still coming through the phone, a distant, angry sound that barely registered in his mind. The board had the financial records. The chairman had turned against him. The captain himself had received orders from the new owner of Lancaster Corporation. Nothing about this was a coincidence. Richard suddenly stood, his body moving before his mind could fully catch up. The force of his motion sent his whiskey glass crashing to the floor, shattering into 1,000 shards against the pristine carpet of first class. His voice erupted through the cabin. Who? His breath was sharp, uneven. Who the hell is the new owner? No one answered. A cold sweat clung to the back of his neck. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it. His entire life, his career, his legacy. Who had taken it from him? Then, slowly, Marcus Grant rose from his seat. He moved with an effortless calm, brushing an invisible speck of dust from his cuff before adjusting the sleeves of his suit. He wasn't hurried. He wasn't concerned. And when he finally met Richard's eyes, his voice was smooth as steel. I am. The words landed like a bullet. Richard stared, his breath hitching, his mind scrambling to reject what he had just heard. It wasn't possible. There was no way the man he had humiliated, the man he had set up, the man he had dismissed as beneath him, was now his boss. Marcus took a step closer, and Richard instinctively backed away, his legs hitting the seat behind him. You wanted to teach me a lesson, didn't you? Marcus's voice remained dangerously even. About knowing my place. He tilted his head slightly. Funny how things work out. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. The whispers in first class had become a murmur of shock. Some passengers weren't even pretending not to watch anymore. Lisa, the flight attendant, pressed a hand to her mouth. The security officers, who had once been poised to arrest Marcus, now stood uncertain, waiting for an order that would never come. Richard clenched his fists. You set me up, he growled. You think this is over? Marcus gave him the kind of look a man gives a dying animal. Oh, Richard, he said softly. This isn't over. His voice darkened. This is just the beginning. Richard's breath came fast and uneven. He had spent his entire life owning people like Marcus. But now he was the one being dismissed. Marcus straightened his cuff one last time before delivering the final blow. Enjoy your last flight as CEO. Richard's stomach twisted. Richard Lancaster had spent his entire life commanding rooms like this. No matter where he was, an executive boardroom, a private jet, or first class on a luxury flight, he was always the one in control. His presence alone dictated the rules. People adjusted themselves around him, either out of fear, admiration, or both. Now, the air had shifted in a way that felt irreversible. He could feel it in the weight of every pair of eyes now fixed on him. The once subtle whispers had grown into open conversations, murmurs that carried the unmistakable edge of mockery and disbelief. He had long been accustomed to hushed discussions following his presence, but those had always been filled with deference. This was different. He was no longer the subject of admiration. He was the spectacle. His breathing was unsteady, his pulse hammering against his skull as he tried to process what had just happened. Marcus Grant, the same man he had humiliated, the same man he had set up, the same man he had dismissed as insignificant, owns me now. The realization sent a sharp wave of nausea rolling through him. His hands trembled as he reached for the loaner phone Lisa had given him earlier, his own still missing from wherever it had been taken. He barely registered the motion of swiping through the screen, his mind racing through every possible way this could be salvaged. Then, the sound that truly shattered him. Richard's head jerked up sharply, his gaze landing on a man sitting just a few rows ahead. Mid-40s, salt and pepper beard, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit that suggested old money, the kind that had never needed to prove itself. The man shook his head, exhaling through his nose as if witnessing something both pitiful and hilarious at the same time. Jesus, he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The great Richard Lancaster, sold out by his own company. A ripple of amusement spread through first class. Someone chuckled. A woman to Richard's left whispered something to her companion, and while he couldn't quite catch the words, he didn't need to. He knew what humiliation felt like. His fingers curled around the phone in his hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. His last chance was that the board hadn't made a final decision yet, that this could still be undone. He could explain it, spin it, throw someone else under the bus. This wasn't over. But when he finally looked down at the screen, reality struck him with the force of a freight train. That was an email. The subject line alone made his blood turn ice cold. Termination notice. Immediate action required. For a moment, Richard forgot to breathe. His thumb hovered over the notification, refusing to tap it, as if delaying it could somehow alter the reality of what was already happening. But his body moved on instinct, and before he could stop himself, the email opened. The message was short, brutal. Effective immediately, Richard Lancaster is removed as Chief Executive Officer of Lancaster Corporation. All privileges revoked. Access restricted. Further legal action pending review. The board of directors has unanimously selected a successor. He stared at the words, his vision blurring at the edges. His grip on the phone slackened. This wasn't just a temporary setback. His knees buckled as the weight of it all crashed down, and before he realized it, his body had slumped back into his seat. He wasn't sure if he sat down voluntarily or if his legs had simply given up beneath him. The murmurs in first class hadn't stopped. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Someone laughed. That was just someone, a random passenger who had been watching him fall. Richard closed his eyes, gripping the bridge of his nose. He could already picture the news headlines, the humiliation waiting for him the moment this plane landed. Richard Lancaster had built his empire on the principle that power was absolute. He believed that as long as he had wealth, status, and influence, there would always be a way out. There would always be someone willing to protect him, someone eager to salvage his position, someone too afraid to let him fall completely. But as he sat there, his breath unsteady and his hands still gripping the phone that had just delivered his death sentence, he realized something he had never once considered. There was no one left. The board had cut him loose. His name had been wiped from the company he built. His fortune would be picked apart by lawsuits before he even had a chance to fight back. The press would be relentless. His enemies would be celebrating, and the world, his world, would move on without him. He felt sick. He barely registered the presence of the flight attendant standing beside him until she spoke. "Mr. Lancaster." Her voice was polite, professional, but there was something beneath it, something that told him this was not a request. Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to look up. The blonde flight attendant, Lisa, stood just to his left, hands clasped, neatly in front of her. There was no trace of uncertainty now, no hesitance like before. She knew exactly what she was doing. "We'll be landing shortly," she continued. "Upon arrival, airport security will be escorting you off the plane." A low murmur spread through first class. Richard's jaw clenched. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I'm not a criminal." Lisa gave him a tight, practiced smile. "Regardless, sir, arrangements have been made." Richard shook his head, barely suppressing the rage bubbling just beneath his skin. "This is humiliating. You have no right." Lisa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "There's a seat prepared for you." Richard froze. Something about the way she said it, the deliberate phrasing, the slight emphasis, made his stomach twist. He swallowed thickly. What the hell does that mean?" Lisa straightened, her expression unreadable. Then, in the same professional tone she had used a moment ago, she said, "In the cargo hold." Richard blinked, convinced he had misheard her. "You what?" Lisa's smile never wavered. "There's limited space on this flight," she said, as if explaining the logistics of a simple seating issue. "Considering your current status, it was determined that the most appropriate place for you upon landing is with the cargo." A stunned silence followed, not just from one person, not just a whisper of amusement, but actual, audible laughter spreading through first class like wildfire. Someone clapped. Someone whistled. Richard barely had the presence of mind to recognize the waves of applause breaking out behind him. His breath came fast, uneven. "You can't be serious," he hissed, his face flushing red. You think you can treat me like this?" Lisa simply smiled again, stepping back to allow the security officers, who had now moved closer, to do their job. "You don't have much of a choice, sir." One of the officers placed a firm hand on Richard's shoulder, wordlessly signaling for him to stand. For a split second, he thought about resisting, thought about standing his ground, thought about demanding a lawyer, thought about reminding these people who he was. But then he saw Marcus Grant, still seated, still watching him with quiet satisfaction, his face betraying nothing but an air of inevitability. This wasn't just Marcus winning. This was Marcus ending him. Richard's body finally gave up fighting. With no other choice, he allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. He could still hear the applause, still hear the whispers of amusement, still feel the weight of his own downfall crushing him. As he was led toward the front of the cabin, past the rows of people who no longer feared him, he realized one last, terrible thing. He wasn't Richard Lancaster, CEO, anymore. He was just another disgraced man walking toward the exit. And when the plane landed, he would be treated exactly as baggage. The landing was smooth. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Marcus Grant remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. Around him, first-class passengers were already shifting, gathering their belongings, eager to step back into their perfectly curated lives. For them, this flight was just another minor event, a story to tell over cocktails or to chuckle about with their friends. But for two men on this plane, it had been a battle of power, pride, and justice, a battle that had ended in only one possible way. Marcus didn't rush. He waited until the cabin doors opened, until the flow of passengers had begun making its way down the aisle. And only then did he rise, buttoning his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. As he stepped out onto the jet bridge, the first thing he felt was the warmth of the morning sun filtering through the terminal windows. He inhaled deeply, taking in the fresh air of victory. Then, with the ease of a man who had just finished the final move of a long, well-played game, he pulled out his phone. A single message had already been drafted, waiting to be sent. "It's done. Remove his name from the shareholder list." He hit send. And with that, Richard Lancaster ceased to exist in the world of power he had once controlled. The walls of the small prison cell were a dull, lifeless gray, the kind of color that slowly ate away at a man's spirit. Richard Lancaster sat on the thin mattress, elbows resting on his knees, eyes vacant. The news was playing on the small television mounted in the corner of the cell. He wasn't sure why he even bothered watching anymore. Every channel was the same. Every headline was a reminder of how far he had fallen. The end of Lancaster. Former CEO faces multiple investigations. Marcus Grant takes control of multi-billion-dollar empire. One of the largest corporate downfalls in history. What led to the demise of Richard Lancaster? Richard exhaled slowly, leaning back against the cold, unforgiving wall. He had spent his life believing that power made him untouchable, that wealth made him immune, that the people he crushed on his way to the top would never have the ability to fight back. But he had been wrong. Power was not absolute. Respect could not be bought. And justice? Justice had a way of finding those who thought they were above it. For the first time in his life, Richard Lancaster understood what it meant to lose everything. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that there would be no second chances. The end. Now I want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in this takedown? Did Richard get what he deserved, or should Marcus have gone even further? Comment below, and let's talk about it. And if you love stories filled with power, justice, and ruthless twists, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what happens next.